Frank Sinatra built a helipad for JFK. Kennedy never showed up. What Frank did next shocked everyone. The sound of a sledgehammer hitting concrete echoed through the California desert. Frank Sinatra swung again, his expensive suit jacket discarded on the ground, his white shirt soaked with sweat. He was destroying something he'd built with his own money, his own vision, his own desperate hope. A helipad. Not just any helipad. The helipad he'd constructed for the President of the United States. Workers stood at a distance, watching their boss lose control. They'd never seen Frank like this. They'd seen him angry before, temperamental, demanding. But this was different. This was rage mixed with something else. Heartbreak, humiliation, the realization that no matter how high you climb, no matter how much power you accumulate, some doors will always remain closed. 3 days earlier, Frank Sinatra had been on top of the world. He'd just finished renovating his entire Palm Springs compound in preparation for a presidential visit. New guest rooms, new furniture, a complete security overhaul, and the helipad, a concrete landing pad built specifically so that John F. Kennedy could arrive in style, in safety, in the home of his friend Frank Sinatra. But Kennedy never came, and the reason why would shatter Frank's understanding of loyalty, friendship, and his place in the world he thought he'd conquered. To understand what happened in Palm Springs in March 1962, you need to understand the relationship between Frank Sinatra and the Kennedy family. It's a story about ambition, about the American dream, and about what happens when a man who spent his entire life fighting for respect discovers that respect has limits he can never cross. Frank Sinatra was born in Hoboken, New Jersey in 1915, the son of Italian immigrants. His father was a firefighter, his mother was a midwife, and a political operative in local Democratic circles. From his mother, Frank learned that politics was power, real power, the kind that could change laws, protect friends, destroy enemies. Frank watched his mother navigate the world of ward bosses and political machines, and he understood something fundamental. If you wanted to matter, you needed to be close to power. By the 1950s, Frank had achieved fame beyond measure. He was the biggest entertainer in America. He'd come back from career collapse to win an Oscar. His record sold millions. He commanded respect in Hollywood, in Las Vegas, in boardrooms across the country. But Frank wanted something more. He wanted to matter beyond entertainment. He wanted to be taken seriously by the people who ran the country. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born in Brookline, Massachusetts in 1917, just 2 years after Frank. But Kennedy came from a different world entirely. Old money, political dynasty, Harvard education. His father, Joseph Kennedy, had been ambassador to Great Britain. The Kennedys were American royalty, the kind of family that Frank's immigrant parents could only dream about. But the Kennedys had a problem. They were Catholic, and America had never elected a Catholic president. There was prejudice, suspicion, fear that a Catholic president would take orders from the Pope. And despite all their money and connections, the Kennedys needed help breaking through that barrier. They needed someone who could reach regular Americans, working-class Americans, the people who didn't trust political dynasties but who trusted entertainment, glamour, star power. They needed Frank Sinatra. Frank and JFK first met in the early 1950s at a party in Los Angeles. Kennedy was a young senator then, charming and ambitious. Frank was immediately drawn to him. Here was someone from that world Frank had always admired, that world of power and influence, and Kennedy was treating Frank like an equal. They talked about politics, about the future, about what America could be, and Frank felt something he hadn't felt before. He felt like he belonged in that conversation. By 1960, Kennedy was running for president, and Frank went all in. He didn't just support Kennedy, he became one of his most visible advocates. Frank organized fundraisers that brought in millions of dollars. He performed at rallies. He produced campaign songs. He used his connections in Hollywood and Las Vegas to marshal support. And most importantly, Frank used his influence with labor unions, with working-class Italian and Irish communities, with the people who loved Frank Sinatra and would listen to what he had to say. Frank threw himself into the campaign with an intensity that surprised even his closest friends. Dean Martin watched Frank during those months and saw something he'd never seen before. Frank was energized, purposeful, driven by something beyond ego or ambition. Frank believed. He believed that Kennedy could change America, and he believed that by helping Kennedy win, Frank would finally earn the respect he'd been chasing his entire life. On election night, November 8, 1960, Frank hosted a party at his home. Dean was there. Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, who'd married Kennedy's sister Patricia, was there. They watched the returns come in, state by state. It was close, agonizingly close, and as the night wore on, and it became clear that Kennedy was going to win, Frank was euphoric. He hugged everyone in the room. He opened champagne. He called it the greatest night of his life, because Frank believed that this was just the beginning. He'd helped elect a president, and now he'd be part of that inner circle. He'd be consulted on decisions, he'd be invited to the White House, he'd matter in a way that transcended entertainment. Frank Sinatra would be a man of influence, a man of substance, a man who belonged in the rooms where history was made. The inauguration in January 1961 seemed to confirm everything Frank hoped for. Frank organized the inaugural gala, a star-studded event that raised money and set the tone for the glamorous new Kennedy administration. Frank performed. He brought in Ella Fitzgerald, Nat King Cole, Harry Belafonte. It was the hottest ticket in Washington, and when it was over, Kennedy thanked Frank personally, warmly, treating him like a trusted friend. After the inauguration, Frank started making plans. Kennedy had mentioned visiting California, maybe staying at Frank's place in Palm Springs. It was casual, the way these things always started, but for Frank, it was everything. The President of the United States was going to stay at his home. Frank immediately began renovations. The Palm Springs compound was already impressive. Frank had bought it in the 1950s, a sprawling estate in the desert with mountain views and complete privacy. But for a presidential visit, it needed to be more. Frank hired contractors. He added guest rooms, each one decorated with care. He installed new communications equipment so the president could stay in touch with Washington. He had the entire property swept for security, installing new locks, new lighting, new everything. And he built the helipad. It was Frank's idea. Kennedy traveled with Secret Service, with staff, with reporters. Arriving by helicopter would be easier, more secure, more dramatic. So Frank hired engineers and construction crews and had them pour a concrete landing pad on his property, complete with proper markings and lighting for night arrivals. The workers thought it was excessive. One of the foremen, a man named Jim Mahoney, later recalled the project. Mr. Sinatra was obsessed with every detail. He'd come out every day to check on the progress. He wanted it perfect. He kept saying, "The President of the United States is going to land here. It has to be perfect." Frank spent over $200,000 on the renovations. In 1961, that was serious money. But Frank didn't care about the cost. This wasn't about money. This was about respect. This was about proving that Frank Sinatra had arrived, that he was more than just an entertainer, that he was someone the President of the United States could trust. Dean Martin visited during the renovations. He walked around the property, looking at all the work, and he felt uneasy. He'd known Frank for over a decade by then, and he knew how Frank invested himself emotionally in relationships, in expectations. Dean pulled Frank aside one afternoon. "Frank, this is a lot of work for a visit." Frank smiled, excited. "Dean, the president is coming. You don't understand what this means." "I understand what it means to you," Dean said carefully. "I just hope you're not setting yourself up for disappointment." Frank waved him off. "Kennedy's my friend. He appreciates what I did for him. This is just the beginning, Dean. You'll see." But Dean wasn't the only one who was worried. Peter Lawford was in an impossible position. He was Frank's friend, a member of the Rat Pack, someone who'd performed alongside Frank for years. But he was also Kennedy's brother-in-law, married to Patricia Kennedy. And Peter was hearing things from the Kennedy family that worried him deeply. Bobby Kennedy, the president's brother and attorney general, had never liked Frank. Bobby was straight-laced, moralistic, deeply concerned with appearances, and Bobby knew about Frank's reputation, about the rumors of connections to organized crime figures. In the 1950s, Frank had been photographed with men like Sam Giancana, a Chicago mob boss. Frank insisted these were just casual acquaintances, people he'd run into in nightclubs, but Bobby didn't believe that. Bobby believed Frank was a liability, someone whose associations could damage the Kennedy presidency. In early 1962, Bobby started putting pressure on his brother. The president couldn't be seen associating with Frank Sinatra. It would give ammunition to Republicans, to journalists, to anyone looking to undermine the administration. Bobby was insistent. The president needed to distance himself from Frank. Peter Lawford knew this was coming. He'd been in meetings where Bobby had made his case. He'd heard the president waver, caught between friendship and political necessity. And Peter knew he was going to be the one who had to tell Frank, because he was the bridge between these two worlds, and that bridge was about to collapse. In March 1962, President Kennedy was scheduled to visit California. The plan had been for him to stay at Frank's compound in Palm Springs. Frank had been preparing for months. He'd invited friends, planned parties, mapped out every detail of the presidential visit. He talked about it constantly. Dean, Sammy, everyone in Frank's orbit knew how much this meant to him. A week before the president was scheduled to arrive, Peter Lawford's phone rang. It was Bobby Kennedy. "Peter, the president can't stay at Frank's place." Peter felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean?" "The associations are too problematic. J. Edgar Hoover has files. If the president stays with Frank, it becomes a story. We can't have that story. Bobby, Frank's been preparing for months. He's spent a fortune. I don't care what he spent." Bobby cut him off. "This is decided. The president will stay at Bing Crosby's place instead." Bing Crosby, a Republican, someone who hadn't lifted a finger to help Kennedy get elected. The insult couldn't have been clearer. Peter hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long time. He knew what this would do to Frank. He knew the humiliation, the betrayal Frank would feel, and he knew that as the messenger, he would bear the brunt of Frank's rage. Peter called Frank the next day. His hands were shaking as he dialed. Frank answered on the second ring, his voice cheerful. "Peter, everything's set for next week?" "Frank, I need to talk to you about that." There was a pause. Frank's voice changed, became guarded. "What's wrong?" "The president's schedule has changed. He's not going to be able to stay at your place." Silence. Long, terrible silence. Then Frank said quietly, "What are you talking about?" "There are security concerns, logistics. It's just easier if he stays somewhere else." "Where?" Frank's voice was cold now. Peter hesitated. He knew this would be the worst part. Bing Crosby's place. The line went dead. Frank had hung up. Within an hour, Frank called back. But he didn't call Peter. He called everyone he knew in Washington, everyone with connections to the Kennedy administration. He wanted answers. He wanted to know who made this decision and why. And slowly, through various channels, Frank learned the truth. Bobby Kennedy had blackballed him. Bobby had convinced the president that Frank was a liability, that Frank's associations made him unsuitable company for the president of the United States. Frank was devastated. Not angry yet. Devastated. He'd spent 2 years working for Kennedy's election. He'd raised money, performed at rallies, used every ounce of his influence to help Kennedy win. And this was how Kennedy repaid him, by treating him like a criminal, like someone to be ashamed of, like someone who wasn't good enough. Dean Martin got a call that night. Frank's voice was shaking. "Dean, Kennedy's not coming." "I heard. I'm sorry, Frank." "Do you know why? Do you know what Bobby told people? That I'm not respectable enough, that my friends are questionable, that the President of the United States can't be seen with me." Dean didn't know what to say. He'd warned Frank that this might happen, but he took no satisfaction in being right. "I gave them everything, Dean, everything, and this is what I get? This is how they treat me? Frank, these are politicians. They use people. That's what they do." "I thought he was different," Frank said, and his voice cracked. "I thought Kennedy was different. I thought we were friends." The next day, Frank went to his Palm Springs compound. He walked through the new guest rooms, the upgraded security, the carefully chosen furniture. He stood on the helipad, the concrete pad he'd had poured for Kennedy's helicopter. And something inside Frank shattered. He called the construction foreman, Jim Mahoney. "Mr. Sinatra, what can I do for you?" "I want you to destroy the helipad." Mahoney thought he'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "The helipad. I want it torn up, demolished. I want it gone." "Mr. Sinatra, we just finished that. It cost—" "I don't care what it cost," Frank shouted. "I want it destroyed. Today. Right now." But when the crew arrived with their equipment, Frank stopped them. He picked up a sledgehammer himself, and in his dress shoes and his expensive suit pants, Frank Sinatra began smashing the concrete helipad with his own hands. The crew stood back watching. Frank swung the sledgehammer again and again, his face red, sweat pouring down his face. He was crying and screaming and destroying the thing he'd built with such hope, such stupid, naive hope. Jim Mahoney would later tell reporters, "I'd never seen anything like it." Here was Frank Sinatra, one of the biggest stars in the world, destroying something that cost him a fortune. But it wasn't about the money, it was about what it represented. Every swing of that hammer was Frank trying to destroy the humiliation, the betrayal. But you can't destroy feelings with a hammer, you just can't. Dean Martin drove out to Palm Springs that evening. Someone had called him, told him what Frank was doing. When Dean arrived, the helipad was rubble. Frank was sitting on the ground beside it, the sledgehammer lying next to him. His hands were bleeding from the work. His shirt was torn. He looked up when Dean approached, and Dean saw something in Frank's eyes he'd never seen before. Brokenness. Complete, utter brokenness. Dean sat down beside him. He didn't say anything. What was there to say? They sat there in silence as the sun set over the desert, casting long shadows across the destroyed helipad. Finally, Frank spoke. "I thought I'd finally made it, Dean. I thought I was finally someone they'd respect. Not just the singer, not just the entertainer, someone who mattered." "You do matter, Frank." "No," Frank said, shaking his head. "Not to them. To them, I'm still just the Italian kid from Hoboken, the guy who hangs around with the wrong people, the guy who's good enough to raise money and throw parties, but not good enough to be seen with, not when it really counts." Dean put his hand on Frank's shoulder. "Their loss, Frank, their loss." But Frank wasn't listening. He was staring at the rubble of the helipad, at the physical manifestation of his shattered dreams. "I'll never forgive them for this, Dean. Never." And he didn't. The betrayal fractured relationships that had seemed unbreakable. Peter Lawford bore the brunt of Frank's rage. Frank blamed Peter for not fighting harder, for not standing up to Bobby Kennedy, for being the messenger of Frank's humiliation. Within weeks, Frank had cut Peter out of his life completely. Peter was removed from upcoming Rat Pack films. His phone calls went unanswered. For all practical purposes, Peter Lawford ceased to exist in Frank Sinatra's world. Sammy Davis Jr. watched it happen with growing fear. Sammy had his own complicated relationship with the Kennedys. He'd been uninvited from the inauguration because he'd married a white woman, My Brit, and the Kennedys didn't want that controversy. Sammy had swallowed that humiliation because Frank had told him to, because Frank had said Kennedy was worth it. Now, seeing Frank's pain, Sammy wondered if any of it had been worth it. Dean tried to stay neutral. He understood Frank's pain, but he also understood that politics was a dirty business, that loyalty in Washington meant something different than loyalty among friends. Dean maintained his relationship with Frank, but he refused to cut off Peter entirely. And Frank, despite his rage, never demanded that Dean choose, because Dean was different. Dean had always been different. The Kennedy administration continued without Frank Sinatra. The president never publicly acknowledged what had happened. There was no apology, no explanation. Frank was simply erased from the picture, as if he'd never mattered at all. Frank threw himself back into his career with renewed intensity. He recorded some of his greatest albums in the years after the Kennedy betrayal. There was anger in his voice now, a harder edge. He still performed, still made movies, still commanded respect in his world. But something had changed. Frank had learned a lesson he'd spent his whole life trying to avoid. That no matter how successful you became, no matter how much money you made, or how famous you got, there were doors that would always be closed to you. There were rooms you would never be allowed to enter. In November 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The nation mourned. Hollywood mourned. Frank was performing in Las Vegas when he heard the news. He canceled his show and retreated to his dressing room. No one knows what Frank felt in those moments. He never spoke publicly about Kennedy's death. He never attended any memorial services. Some said it was because he was still angry, still hurt by the betrayal. Others said it was grief, that despite everything, Frank had loved Kennedy and the loss was too much to bear. Dean Martin believed it was both. Frank felt everything intensely. Dean said years later, he loved intensely and he hated intensely. Kennedy's death didn't erase what happened in Palm Springs, but it complicated it. How do you stay angry at someone who's dead? How do you forgive someone who can't ask for forgiveness? Peter Lawford tried to reconcile with Frank many times over the years. He'd call, he'd send messages through mutual friends. He'd show up at places where he knew Frank would be, hoping for a chance to explain, to apologize, to bridge the gap. Frank never relented. For 30 years, Frank Sinatra refused to speak to Peter Lawford. They'd been friends, partners, brothers in the Rat Pack, and Frank erased him as completely as he'd erased that helipad. In 1984, Peter Lawford was dying. He had liver cancer. the result of years of drinking. He was broke, his career long over. Some of his old friends rallied around him, but not Frank. People begged Frank to visit Peter, to give him some peace before he died. Frank refused. When Peter Lawford died that December, Frank did not attend the funeral. He sent no flowers, no message, nothing. Dean Martin went to the funeral and felt sick about it. He knew Frank was wrong, knew that holding a grudge for 3 decades against a man who'd been caught between impossible loyalties was cruel. But Dean also knew that Frank couldn't let it go. The wound was too deep. Years later, a journalist asked Frank about the Kennedy years, about what happened in Palm Springs. Frank's face hardened. "I don't talk about that." "But Mr. Sinatra, don't you think?" "I said I don't talk about it." Frank's voice was ice. Next question. "The helipad was never rebuilt. The compound in Palm Springs remained, but that space where the landing pad had been stayed empty." Frank kept it that way deliberately. A reminder, not of Kennedy, but of the lesson Frank had learned, that the world was divided into those who belonged and those who didn't, and no amount of talent or success or money could change which side of that line you were born on. Dean Martin understood something about that day in March 1962 that perhaps no one else did. It wasn't really about Kennedy. It was about Frank's lifelong need to be accepted, to be respected, to be seen as more than just the entertainer. Frank had spent his entire career fighting against being dismissed, against being patronized, against being treated as less than, and in one phone call, all of that came crashing down. The tragedy wasn't that Kennedy didn't stay at Frank's house. The tragedy was what it represented, that Frank could have everything, fame, wealth, power, influence, and still not be enough. That the boy from Hoboken who'd clawed his way to the top of American entertainment could still be told he wasn't respectable enough, wasn't suitable enough, wasn't good enough to associate with the people he'd helped put in power. Frank Sinatra lived for another 36 years after that March day in 1962. He continued performing, continued recording, continued being Frank Sinatra. But those who knew him best said something changed after Palm Springs. The betrayal left a scar that never healed. It made Frank harder, more suspicious, quicker to cut people out of his life if he sensed disloyalty. Because if the President of the United States could betray him after everything Frank had done, then anyone could betray him. The demolished helipad became part of Frank Sinatra's legend, a story told and retold about his temper, his pride, his refusal to be disrespected. But it was more than that. It was a monument to disappointment, to the limits of the American dream, to the realization that some doors remain closed no matter how hard you knock. Dean Martin was with Frank in Palm Springs one last time in the 1980s. They were old men by then, their performing days behind them. They sat on Frank's patio, looking out at the desert. Dean glanced at the empty space where the helipad had been. "You ever think about it, Frank? About that day?" Frank was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Every time I come here, I see it. Not the helipad. The hope I had when I built it. That stupid goddamn hope." "It wasn't stupid, Frank." "Yes, it was," Frank said. "I should have known better. I should have known that to them I'd always be the singer, the entertainment, never the equal." Dean didn't argue, because maybe Frank was right. Or maybe the truth was more complicated. Maybe Kennedy had valued Frank's friendship, but valued his presidency more. Maybe Bobby had been protecting his brother. Maybe Peter had been caught in an impossible situation. Maybe everyone involved had reasons that made sense to them. But none of that changed what it did to Frank. None of that erased the humiliation, the betrayal, the shattering of Frank's belief that he'd finally earned his place at the table. Frank Sinatra died in May 1998. He was 82 years old. The world remembered him as the greatest entertainer of the 20th century, as the chairman of the board, as the man who defined cool for generations. Presidents issued statements praising his contributions to American culture, but no Kennedy spoke at his funeral. That bridge, demolished on a March day in 1962, was never rebuilt. The Palm Springs compound eventually passed to other owners. The space where the helipad had been was eventually built over, covered up, erased from the physical landscape. But those who knew the story never forgot it, because it wasn't really about a helipad. It was about a man who wanted desperately to belong to a world that would never fully accept him. It was about the price of loyalty and the pain of betrayal. It was about Frank Sinatra learning that even legends can be rejected. Dean Martin once said, In one of the rare moments when he talked about that day, Frank built that helipad because he believed that friendship mattered, that loyalty should be rewarded, that if you helped someone reach the top, they'd remember you when they got there. And when that belief was proven wrong, something in Frank died. Not all of him, but a part. The part that still believed the world could be fair. That's the real story of the helipad. Not the demolition, not the rage, but the hope that preceded it. The belief that Frank Sinatra, through talent and work and loyalty, could transcend his origins and be accepted by the American establishment, and the crushing realization that he couldn't. Frank Sinatra built a helipad for the President of the United States. And when that president chose to land somewhere else, Frank destroyed it with his own hands. But what Frank was really trying to destroy was the pain of knowing that no matter how high he climbed, he would never be high enough, never be respectable enough, never be enough.